Hey, this is David McCree, CPA, the nonprofit tax guy. Should you use Excel or another electronic worksheet to summarize your financial transactions for your nonprofit? So in order to prepare a Form 990EZ or Form 990, you have to have a method to summarize your financial transactions into proper income and expense categories. An electronic worksheet like Excel or Google Sheets is one method that a small organization may choose to use. Worksheets have advantages and limitations. The advantages are that they're inexpensive and sometimes even free, and they're easy to use with very little training. The primary disadvantage is that they are two-dimensional. So if you want to summarize information based on criteria other than what's in the column headings here, it can become awkward very quickly. We need to summarize our transactions into a form that will make data entry onto the Form 990EZ very simple. Sometimes a worksheet is great for doing that, and sometimes it isn't. So let's see why. So now we're going to look at the expense section of Form 990EZ. Lines 10 through 15 have predefined expense categories the IRS wants you to use. These categories are what we call natural classifications. In other words, it's natural to label an expense based on its purpose: compensation, printing, rent, grants paid out, and so on. Now, you're probably aware that nonprofits are often judged based on how much of their money they spend on programs rather than on overhead and fundraising. While there's no legal requirement that a specific amount be spent on programs, spending too much on overhead or on fundraising can raise questions in some cases. For that reason, it's helpful for a nonprofit organization to not only be able to group its transactions into natural classifications, but also into functional classifications. So this means you need to have some method for grouping transactions based on whether they're spent on programs, on overhead, or on fundraising. Overhead is a common term for what's formally known as general and administrative expenses, or on the Form 990, it's referred to as management and general expenses. On the 990EZ, it's not necessary to separately show expenses in the general and administrative category or in the fundraising category. They're all lumped together on the page 1 of the 990EZ on lines 10 through 16. However, for a 501c3 public charity, it is necessary to be able to determine and present the total amount of money spent on program expenses. You can see here on page 2, part 3 of the 990EZ in the section called Statement of Program Service Accomplishments. It asks for the total expenses that correspond to each program listed over here in this column. Here is where you list a description of each program, the top 3 programs, and the amount of expenses spent on each one. So in contrast, the full Form 990 requires more detail. So let's have a look at the Form 990. Now this is called the Statement of Functional Expenses, Part 9 on this year's form, and you can see they devote an entire page to expenses. Now, not only are the expenses presented according to their natural classification, which you can see here in the rows, they're also shown divided into functional classifications, or the columns. This makes it easy to see, for instance, how much of each type of expense was spent on programs, how much on management in general, and how much was spent on fundraising. Now, let's look at a basic transaction summary in Excel. Each row is a separate transaction, generally organized by the date on which it occurred. Each column allows us to show the amount of transaction in its natural classification. We have a section for income, and we have a section for expenses. By labeling each of these columns in a way that roughly corresponds to the lines on the Form 990EZ, by totaling the columns, we're able to transfer the totals directly to the proper lines on Form 990EZ. Unfortunately, it's not quite so easy to answer a question like how much money was spent on program services, or how much money was spent on overhead, management in general. Since we're preparing the Form 990EZ, we really only need to determine how much was spent on programs. And for the simplest organizations, this is not difficult. Now consider this transaction summary for a hypothetical Little League baseball organization. They have one program, a baseball team. After we total the columns to enter the income and expenses on page 1 of the 990EZ, it's easy to just eyeball the worksheet to determine which expenses were for programs and which expenses were for management in general or fundraising. Simply by adding up the program expense totals, we can come up with a program expense total for page 2 on the statement of program service accomplishments. It's easy. So for instance, if we look at the expense columns here, advertising, that's probably a program service expense. Printing may be. It could be programs printed for the game, or it could be management in general. It could be you printed out some financial statements and had them reproduced. It could be for fundraising. Maybe you printed fundraising letters. Coaching, that would be program expense. Field rental, program expense. Field maintenance, that would be program expense. Professionals fees, no, that's probably going to be general and management in general. Insurance, that's probably management in general. Uniforms and gear, that's probably going to be, that's definitely going to be program service. T-shirt purchases and concession supplies, those are not going to be either. Those will have their own lines on for sales of inventory on the page 1 of the 990EZ. Now, here's where the complication comes in. What if the organization had two teams, a recreational team and a competitive team? To track income and expenses for each team, you might need twice as many columns. This would be way too complicated, and it would result in many data entry errors. If the organization decides not to track expenses separately for each team, then a worksheet would be just fine. Otherwise, a more robust bookkeeping solution is probably going to be needed. In another video, I'll show you how to push the limits of a worksheet like this to get the information you need, even if you have multiple programs. It's not a perfect solution, but it works well if you just have a few hundred transactions during the whole year. The takeaway here is that a worksheet is fine for summarizing transactions if you only have a few hundred, maybe up to 500 or so transactions each year, and if you only have one program or several very closely related programs that can be grouped into one program for purposes of the 990EZ. If you have more than 500 transactions or so each year, or if your organization has 2 or more separate programs, you really need to consider a more feature-rich bookkeeping solution. Now consider this, and I'm going to show you a statement of activities, or also in the form of statement of functional expenses. Let's say you have this organization that helps homeless people. One program you conduct is a soup kitchen. It receives donated food and purchases some food, and it rents part of a building to serve food to the homeless. Another program the organization conducts is a shelter. The organization rents a building which it has equipped with beds and showers to help get the homeless off the streets at night. These two programs are sufficiently different that, at least from a management perspective, tracking each program's income and expenses separately is highly desirable. For the 990EZ, it would be best practice to show the program expenses separately as well. This is where a bookkeeping solution like Quicken or QuickBooks is probably needed. When you have more than one program, your bookkeeping solution needs to be able not only to produce summary reports that show expenses based on natural classifications, it also needs to be able to produce a summary based on functional classifications like what you're seeing on the screen. So this type of report you're looking at is called a statement of activities. In non-profit accounting, that's what it's called. And it's the same as a profit and loss report used by for-profit organizations. The statement of activities corresponds to the statement of functional expenses as is required on the full Form 990. Now, notice the natural classifications on the left here, and the functional classifications across the top in columns. To do this properly, you need a feature called class tracking. When you record each transaction, instead of just assigning it to a natural category and being done with it, natural category being like printing or rent expense. You'll also assign it to a class, such as, in this case, soup kitchen, or shelter, or the annual gala, or a special event like a silent auction, or management general, or fundraising. And this will allow you to produce the reports that you'll need to properly prepare the full Form 990. It's also very helpful in preparing the 990EZ if you have more than one program. Now, in the realm of affordable bookkeeping solutions, Quicken Home and Business and QuickBooks Online Plus are the only two that I'm familiar with that offer class tracking. Quicken, of course, is the least expensive by far. Now, how do you know whether to use Quicken or QuickBooks? My opinion is that if cash is your only asset and you have no liabilities like credit cards or loans to track, then Quicken is just fine. It's an electronic check register, and it allows class tracking, which is it's very unusual, okay, to find that in a small accounting package like this. Tremendous benefit to Quicken having class tracking. Now, if the organization has a credit card balances, or if it owns a building or equipment, it should consider QuickBooks Online Plus. That is right here, this version, QuickBooks Online Plus. Why this version? Well, that's because the version that has class tracking. The two earlier versions here, Essentials and Simple Start, they do not have class tracking. Unlike many accountants, I am a big fan of using worksheets for small, simple organizations. Keep it cheap, keep it simple. Once you screw up QuickBooks or Quicken, you have a real mess on your hands. Do everything you can to avoid that. Now, there is a trick to using Quicken to produce the reports that you need. Just jumping into Quicken and having at it, entering transactions or downloading them, that's a prescription for disaster. And I will cover that little trick in another video. But it's very important to get the reports you need. You have to set it up right. Okay, at this point, you should have an idea about whether Excel is for you or not. If it is, and you'd like to know more about how to build a worksheet in Excel to record your transactions, and you'd like to do it with the least amount of hair pulling and frustration, I have a course for you and that will teach you how to do just that. And if you will go to nonprofittaxhelp.podia.com, that's where my course lives, and this is the page you will arrive at. You'll find all of my educational instructional materials here. If you just scroll down here to Bookkeeping with Excel, that's my basic Bookkeeping with Excel for Nonprofits, Level 1. And you can view the contents of the course here by clicking on View Course. I have it very reasonably priced. I start out with showing you how to set up a basic Excel transaction summary worksheet. I show you how to set the whole thing up, and you don't have to use Excel, right? You can use Google Sheets, you can use Zoho Office, you can use OpenOffice, LibreOffice, whatever worksheet you want, whatever the Mac has, you can use as well. I show you how to use freeze panes to make data entry much easier. Sometimes these worksheets can get really large and they can be difficult to navigate, and so I show you a really simple trick for navigation. Then I show you how to create an income and expense statement from your Excel worksheet. So once you've finished entering all your transactions, you've got a bunch of columns with data in them and totals. You have to turn that into a profit and loss statement or income and expense, statement of activities, whatever you want to call it, so you can transfer the amounts, the numbers to the tax return. Okay, so I show you how to do that. It requires only some very simple formulas. Okay, anybody can do it. It's not a complicated thing. Then I have a discussion about should you use debits and credits, and I show you how to use debits and credits in your worksheet, and also show you how to do it without knowing anything about debits and credits. Okay, so you don't have to know double entry accounting to do this. Then, really importantly, I show you how to handle multiple bank accounts, credit cards, and PayPal. Okay, if you just got one bank account and that's it, it's pretty easy. But knowing how to organize things when you have 2 or 3 bank accounts, you've got a couple credit cards, you got PayPal, you got Stripe, you got Square. How do you do that? All right. So many people they end up with different tabs with different worksheets, and it just creates a horrible nightmare. I show you how to do it on one sheet, keep everything organized and together. It makes it really simple. I talk about accounting for a change bank or a change fund. You know, an organization that has an event where it accepts cash, it needs to make change, and so it needs to go to the bank and take out a bunch of small bills and coins. I talk about how to handle that and get it back into the bank without double counting your revenue. All right. Then accounting for reimbursements. It's very common for volunteers, officers, directors, employees to purchase things for the nonprofit using their own funds, and then maybe they need to get reimbursed. So when that's the case, I show you how to record that properly. Okay, these are the basics. This is what you need to know to get started with your own spreadsheet. So I hope you'll check it out. I know you'll find value in it. It's very reasonably priced, and I think it'll be just what you need. All right? If you've gotten this far in this video, thank you very much, and have a great day.